The English historian James Anthony Froude once remarked, "Wild animals never kill for sport. Man is the only creature for whom the torture and death of his fellows is amusing in itself." Nowhere does that quote ring truer than in the Middle Ages, when human imagination seemed limitless in inventing ways to inflict pain. Medieval executioners and inquisitors didn't just punish, they turned cruelty into an art form. Today we'll take a grim tour of some of the most disturbing torture devices and methods ever conceived. Welcome to Medieval Madness. The fear of rats, known as musophobia, might seem irrational until rodents become part of your nightmare. In the Tower of London, there was once a cell below the waterline, sometimes called the dungeon among the rats. Prisoners chained inside were left in the dark, while the rising tide brought in sewage, filth, and of course, swarms of hungry vermin. When the water drained away, the rats stayed behind. At first, they would scurry and squeak in the darkness, but soon they turned on the only source of food, the prisoner. What began as nibbling could escalate to flesh being torn away while the victim was still alive. A more calculated form of rat torture supposedly came from China. A prisoner was strapped to a table, naked, with a cage full of rats placed upside down on his stomach. Hot coals were piled on top of the cage, heating the metal. Desperate to escape, the rats clawed and bit through the prisoner's abdomen, burrowing inside the body itself. Later accounts from the 16th century describe using a pottery bowl instead of a cage, with burning charcoal driving the rats down into the very bowels of the victim. During the medieval Inquisitions, accused heretics were dealt with swiftly and mercilessly. One particularly cruel tool was the heretic's fork. This metal rod ended in sharp spikes at both sides. One end was pressed beneath the chin, the other against the breastbone, and the whole device strapped tightly around the neck. The setup forced the victim to keep their head tilted back unnaturally. Swallowing was agony, movement impossible. Even holding the head upright for hours caused severe muscle strain and blinding headaches. But sleep deprivation was the real weapon. As exhaustion set in, a victim's head would eventually drop forward, and the sharp points would dig into throat and jaw. The fork rarely killed outright, but it was often the opening act before harsher punishments or execution. Also called the wooden donkey, this device first appeared in 12th century France. It was shaped like a tall, narrow triangular beam, sharpened along the top like a blade. Prisoners were made to ride it, straddling the point with all their body weight pressing down on their groin and tailbone. Executioners sometimes added weights to the victim's legs, pulling them downward and increasing the torment. Some accounts mention tickling the prisoner's feet to force movement, which only deepened the wounds. Kept on the device long enough, the spine and pelvis could split apart, leaving death as the inevitable outcome. This instrument, often called the choke pear, was crafted from metal and designed to open like petals when a screw was turned. Depending on the alleged crime, it could be inserted into the mouth, the throat, or even more intimate places. Once inside, the torturer rotated the screw, forcing the pear to expand. The sharp edges tore soft tissue, causing massive bleeding and internal damage. If infection didn't kill the victim later, the trauma usually did. Examples still survive in museums, some plain, others disturbingly ornate, like a bronze model displayed in San Gimignano, Italy. One of the most gruesome methods was execution by sawing. Prisoners convicted of crimes like heresy, murder, adultery, or witchcraft could be strung up upside down. This position kept the brain supplied with blood, ensuring consciousness for as long as possible. With legs tied apart, the torturers began cutting between them, slowly working upwards. Sometimes they would stop halfway through to prolong the ordeal, other times continuing until the body was literally split in two. Historical accounts describe Hungarian General Michael Szilágyi being executed this way by the Ottomans in 1460. Just a few years later, during the conquest of Bosnia, the Turks reportedly sawed through hundreds of captured knights, despite promising them mercy. We all know too little water kills, but in medieval France, too much water was weaponized. Victims were force-fed enormous quantities, sometimes through funnels forced into the throat. Stomachs swelled painfully, internal organs strained, and in extreme cases, the stomach lining could rupture. Sometimes the process was interrupted with beatings to induce vomiting, only for the torture to resume again. Other foul liquids, like urine or bile, might replace water. A related method, the infamous Spanish water torture, was more like what we now call waterboarding. A cloth was shoved into the mouth and soaked while water was poured over the victim's face, creating the terrifying sensation of drowning. The French poet François Villon, arrested in 1462, endured this torment. Though his execution was commuted to exile, witnesses said he left Paris broken in both body and spirit. Few devices were as cruelly direct as the intestinal crank. This was less torture than a slow-motion execution. The restrained victim's abdomen was slit open, and a section of intestine pulled out. The end was hooked onto a spindle or crank, which was then turned deliberately slowly. Bit by bit, the entrails were wound around the shaft, stretching up to 18 feet. The victim, still conscious, could only watch in horror as their own body was unraveled before them. Death eventually came from shock, blood loss, and unimaginable pain. Medieval torture devices reveal a dark side of human creativity, where ingenuity was bent not toward progress, but to breaking the body and spirit of others. Today, these methods survive only in history books and museum displays, and for that, we can all be thankful.